The envelope lay on the kitchen table like a ticking bomb, filling the space with its silent but insistent presence. I couldn't tear my gaze away from its smooth surface, when my father's barely noticeable scrawl formed words that seemed destined never to see the light of day. The letter, his final message, had been delivered 5 years after his death, and with every passing moment, as I drew closer to opening it, I felt a growing sense of unease. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along the edge of the seal. A strange, almost ominous premonition haunted me, and I, as if in a fog, struggled to make sense of what was happening. Questions spun in my mind, but none of them were enough to help me make a decision. I, Sharon, had thought that I knew everything about my father's death until today. I was certain that enough time had passed since his loss for me to have come to terms with it, to understand what remained after his disappearance. But this envelope, frozen on the kitchen table, shattered all my convictions, like cold rain suddenly falling on sun-drenched earth. It's funny how life waits until you feel comfortably certain in your daily routine, until you begin to think that everything is behind you, and you can finally breathe easy again, only to pull the rug out from under you. Just when I thought I could stand on my own again, life handed me an old wound, reminding me that it still hadn't healed. "Darling, are you going to open that thing, or just stare at it all day?" Helen's voice sliced through my thoughts like a knife's edge. She always appeared at the most inopportune moments, as if she had a supernatural ability to materialize exactly when my nerves were stretched thin. I couldn't believe she was here, so close, within arm's reach, with her perfectly manicured nails tapping on the granite countertop, making an irritating sound that was all too familiar. This is personal, I told myself mentally, but she had already settled in next to me. Close enough that her expensive Chanel No. 5 scent made my nose itch with irritation. Helen was always around, but never truly part of my life, of the things I considered important. Her interest in my affairs was superficial, too cold, like her smile that never quite reached her eyes, leaving behind only an invisible wall. Nathan would want to know what this meant. He was probably still at the office, trying to convince himself to finish yet another report, find a way to be productive. He didn't understand what was happening, and probably wouldn't want to know. We had been together for several years, and while we loved each other, there were things that couldn't be explained. My life wasn't the way he saw it, and I couldn't hide that from him anymore. And now, here it was, this absurd situation that had caught up with me. The envelope left on the kitchen table, and Helen standing nearby, absorbed in her thoughts, not giving me time to think. My fingers slowly tightened around the envelope, and I began tearing at its edge, feeling the cold air fill the room as if the world itself were holding its breath. "It's really something, darling," Helen said quietly, but her words lacked the tone of admiration I expected to hear. No, this wasn't something to admire, it was a test. A test I couldn't ignore, and now it closed in around me like an invisible noose. I had already fallen in Helen's eyes, just as I had in Nathan's. He reached out to hug me, but I caught Helen's calculating glance over his shoulder. She had already decided how things would unfold. Every gesture, every word of hers seemed like part of a plan I couldn't dismantle but didn't want to accept. My father's words echoed in my mind like a warning that wouldn't let me go. Some battles are worth fighting. My gaze fixed on the envelope, and in that moment, I understood that the time had come. I hugged Nathan back, feeling his warmth and confidence, but my thoughts were already racing in another direction. This money wasn't just an inheritance, it wasn't just material wealth. No, it was ammunition. Ammunition for a war I wasn't sure I wanted to participate in but could no longer avoid. And so, after 15 years of marriage, I found myself wondering, for the first time, if I was ready to go to war with Helen Parker. The question was so clear that I could hardly believe it had come to me. Helen, with her impeccable manners, with her eternal knowledge of how to manipulate people, was not just a mother-in-law. She was an ally in a battle for influence, and now, with this letter in my hands, I understood that her war for control of the inheritance had only just begun. 3 days after receiving the letter, I sat across from Nathan at our dining table, moving the salmon around on my plate as if trying to find a way to drown out my thoughts. His voice matched the melodic clink of the dishes, but his words didn't touch me, They simply disappeared like dust in the air. He was talking about plans to expand the company, and the excitement in his voice made my stomach tighten. "Mom's right, now's the time," he said. Those words, full of hope, were like gunshots, dull and reverberating in my chest. He reached for my hand, and I felt his fingers, but I couldn't respond as he expected. "We've finally made the company what Dad always wanted it to be," he continued, almost not noticing how I pulled away. My thoughts were far from the table, far from their voices. They were with that letter, with those words my father had written to me. I could no longer think of them simply as a message. These were words from the past, weighed down by the fears and ambitions he hadn't had the chance to pass on to me in life. Now I knew Helen wouldn't let me have this inheritance so easily. And I couldn't give up. The room spun. My vision blurred, and I barely heard Richard, sitting across from me, murmur something indistinct. Silence. Even he, usually so confident, looked more disconcerted than I had ever seen him. My mother had always taught me that if you don't defend your rights, no one else will. I said it aloud, and my voice was steady, despite the fury that was building inside me. This fury was not new, but it was gathering force, like a tidal wave. It was the same fury that Nathan had never learned to contain. He never tried. He just sat there, silent, and his silence was as heavy as any shout. "You won't have a choice, Sharon," Nathan said, standing up from the table. His footsteps echoed in the empty room. I didn't know what he meant, but it didn't matter. I was already heading for the stairs. I was going to bed, hoping that when I came down tomorrow, all of this would be gone. I turned, glanced at my family, and said, without turning around, "I expect these papers to be gone." I stopped on the bottom step, holding my breath when I heard Nathan's footsteps behind me. He didn't say a word, but his presence filled the air, like a dense shadow. "Nathan, don't bother coming up tonight," I said, and my words sounded strange, even to me. It wasn't so much a command as a plea. My back felt the weight of Helen's gaze, even though she wasn't nearby. I might have thought her voice was haunting me. "You're making a mistake," her words seeped into my thoughts like poison. Helen's voice was always so calm it sounded almost soothing, but in reality, it was as cold as ice. "Darling, family should stick together." I froze on the bottom step. Her words lodged in my mind like a knife in the body, and I felt the air constrict around me. Family. That word was what kept me in place. I turned around and, despite everything, said, "You're right, Helen. Family should stick together." But at that moment, more than ever, I began to wonder which family Nathan truly belonged to. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this family, her family, had always been at the center of his world, while mine never really found a place in his heart. Later, lying alone in our bed, I could hear Helen and Richard whispering downstairs. Their words were restrained and tense. Helen's sharp whisper, one I could have heard even without the words. In response, Richard muttered something incoherent, and I could feel his nervousness even through the walls. Nathan was silent. His silence was always the loudest. "Helen means, well, she just wants control." Her words came out bitter, like the final chord of a song that had long lost its melody. I held myself back from replying in that moment, though the urge was strong. "You let her do this. Sometimes peace really comes at the price of peace," and I couldn't shake the thought that Nathan likely never understood the cost of that compromise. I pointed to the office, where he was headed, and said with cold certainty, "Is this what you call peace?" I didn't expect an answer, but the door suddenly swung open, and Helen appeared first, her face perfectly composed, showing no emotion or hint of worry. But as soon as her eyes met mine, something flashed across her face, fear, perhaps, or anticipation. She quickly concealed it, like a skilled actress, but I noticed. And she probably knew I had noticed. A moment later, Nathan appeared, and his appearance shocked me. He seemed like a ghost of himself, his movements unnaturally fluid, his gaze lost. Nathan was part of this world, but at that moment, he looked as though he had been torn from it. Sharon, his voice was quiet, his eyes wide. He was stunned. What are you doing? Are you throwing away the files you need? I didn't answer immediately. I picked up the folder and, with a simple motion, let it go. The papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, each word, each name written in those documents now felt so distant and meaningless. Congratulations on the promotion, Michael, I said, and the irony in my voice became unbearable to me. Helen stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the floor, and I felt her presence filled the room instantly. Whatever you think, she began, her voice tense but calm, you've heard what I said. You've heard enough. I turned to Nathan. My words came out almost uncontrollably, like old memories that can't be erased. Have you ever wondered why your father drinks so much at family dinners? Why he can barely look you in the eye? Richard, sitting next to us, flinched. I noticed how his face paled, and he tried to look away. His tension was too obvious. That's enough, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. But Helen immediately interrupted him. No, that's not enough. Her voice was cold and firm, like a knife left in her hand. I pulled out my phone, turning on the recorder. The sharp sound of the device switching on seemed to cut through the silence, which at that moment felt like a thick fog. Helen's voice, as soon as she noticed, filled the hallway. You don't think you can use this against us, do you? Her words were fragmented but sounded threatening. I left the phone on the table, and we all fell silent, listening as every sound, every word, every step was recorded. My heart raced, and with each passing moment, I felt the approaching moment of truth. Helen, with all her cold manipulation, her control over everything and everyone, was now facing something that could destroy her. She sat across from me, her face creased with worry, each wrinkle seeming to tell the story of tension that had reached its limit. Her eyes looked at me with a certain pleading, but this plea was like a trap, a faint, almost imperceptible reminder that she had never intended to be on my side. Did you listen to the recording? Her voice was low, slightly trembling, but with an undertone of guilt that could not go unnoticed. I remained silent, unsure of how to respond, because her question was merely the continuation of the battle she seemed to be winning at every step. Then, once again, 17 times, I glanced at the phone screen, reading the missed calls. Nathan had called twice, sent text messages 38 times. As always, Helen had sent flowers, and there was something terrifying in that, manipulation taking different forms and shades, and now her method seemed increasingly sophisticated. She could have turned me into a shadow of myself if she had wanted to. Thoughts spiraled, but before I could finish them, the doorbell rang. Mom stood up, her expression hardening like a protective armor as she went to open the door. I heard Richard's voice in the hallway, quiet, tense, as it always was in her presence. She doesn't want to, he said, and his voice, as always, was tinged with desperation. Mom slowed her steps, but despite that, her familiar phrase followed, please. I couldn't understand what had happened, but Richard's voice suddenly became fragile, broken, as if years of wear had caught up with him in one moment. He hadn't sounded like this 5 minutes ago. Mom returned, her gaze heavy, as though burdened by the weight of inevitability. Everything was wrong, and I stood in the kitchen doorway, unsure of what to do next. I felt the space around me constricting, denying me any air. It's all right, she said, but Richard looked older than he had 3 days ago. His shoulders were slumped beneath his expensive suit, and with every step, it seemed he was losing pieces of his dignity. He handed me an envelope made of manila paper. What's this? I asked, my voice already an accusation. Richard silently placed the envelope on the counter. I stepped closer, feeling the cold seep into me. Inside, there were just a few documents, but they felt like they were burning my soul. Bank statements, trust documents, Helen's letters to the board. I took them in my hands, and my fingers trembled. His hands trembled too, and I saw how they barely held the envelope, as though it were something terrifying. I should have done this years ago, Richard whispered, his voice trembling, but not from fear, rather, from long-suppressed guilt. I opened the envelope, and the first document made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a contract dated 15 years ago. A document that would have changed everything if I had read it back then. I gathered the papers in the phone, feeling a heavy weight on my chest. It wouldn't let go, like an invisible thread pulling me into the past. I knew I needed to leave, to go out and figure myself out. "I'll be back later," I said, trying to make my voice not betray me. As I almost reached the door, I heard Mom's voice, quiet, but authoritative, as it always was when she didn't want me to miss anything. "Sharon," her words hung in the air, and I, unable to move further, stopped. "Remember what your father always said about forgiveness. It's not about forgetting, but about choosing your own world." She said no more, but her gaze was full of quiet, but firm understanding. She nodded, as if reaffirming that I wasn't alone in this choice. "Just make sure your choice brings you peace, not more war." I didn't answer, just nodded and stepped out into the midday sun, which now seemed cold, almost foreign. As if the sky itself was watching me, unsure of what to tell me to do. Richard's revelations weighed heavily in my bag, like an unexplainable burden that I couldn't get rid of. Nathan's text burned in my pocket like a fiery torch that I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. The park was only 10 minutes away, but I knew those 10 minutes would change everything. When I arrived, Nathan was already sitting on our bench by the pond with the ducks. His shoulders were slumped, his tie loosened, and he looked like a man awaiting execution. He didn't notice me immediately, absorbed in his thoughts, and only when I stopped on the path did he finally speak, without turning around. "I didn't think you'd come." His words hung in the air, and I didn't respond right away. I almost stayed standing, keeping my distance, as if our physical space was necessary to understand what was happening. "Why here?" I finally asked, feeling how the question began to sound like an accusation. "Do you remember our first date, when you said this place felt honest?" He turned to me, and for a moment, the expression on his face flickered, an expression I once knew so well, but now it seemed alien. Nathan abruptly stood up and began pacing back and forth, as he always did when anger overtook him, as if physical movement could somehow calm the storm inside. His footsteps echoed clearly in the silence of the park, blending with the gentle sounds of the pond. His face, usually so calm, was twisted with worry. "I'll fight this." "We'll hire lawyers," he said, not noticing how his words seemed to echo, lost in the space around us. I laughed bitterly, unable to suppress my disappointment. This was too much. The thoughts I had been carrying for months now burst out. It all no longer made sense. There was no us anymore. "There's no us anymore," I said, holding back the tremor in my voice. "Nathan, you made sure of that when you discussed my inheritance with her before talking to me." I feared that his voice would carry across the entire pond, like a thunderclap, but he was still too confident in himself. I looked at his tense figure, feeling how his words lost all their power. Every action of his, every choice he made, it was all under her control. Helen always made me feel that one wrong step would destroy everything, the company, our future, our marriage. And here he stood before me, the man I once loved, and I knew there was no point in fighting for what was already gone. "She didn't destroy our marriage, Nathan," I said, once again suppressing my emotions. "You did, by letting her." I opened one of the intercepted letters from my father with trembling hands. The envelope was dated 2 weeks before his death. I nervously swallowed the lump in my throat and read, gasping for air. "My dear Sharon," the letter began, and for a moment, it felt as though I could hear his voice in every word. "I am reading this aloud, hoping it reaches you in time. There are things you need to know about Helen Parker and why I am leaving you the money. She is not who you think she is." The letter ended abruptly, torn off. I looked back at Nathan. He stood silently, his face tense, eyes full of guilt. I sighed, almost losing my words. "Did you read this?" I asked, not believing he could have remained unaware. He shook his head. "The last letter from my father, about your father being a thief." Mom's voice cracked, like a crystal vase accidentally dropped from a height. She paused, and I felt every sound of hers penetrating my bones. He stole from the company. Helen continued, almost whispering, her words heavy like stones sinking into deep water. Almost ruined us. Richard caught him forging books, but instead of pressing charges, we made a deal. The room seemed to spin. Everything suddenly became too clear and at the same time blurry, like an old photo losing its sharpness. I grabbed the doorframe, trying to steady myself, but my mind was drifting. "You're lying," the words escaped me before I could stop them. "The money. He left you that money?" It was compensation. Money for silence. Actually, Helen. Her voice was like a sweet lie, soaked in false sympathy, and I knew every word was the core of manipulation. "We stayed silent about his embezzlement, and he agreed to leave town to protect your reputation," she continued, looking down at me. All of it felt so dirty that I could feel a wave of anger rising inside me. Mom was silent, but in her eyes, I saw not just despair, but something more. She still knew something was wrong here. Helen, standing before us, was pulling documents from her portfolio like a master pulling cards from a deck. Bank statements, surveillance photos, my father's signature on checks. Each of these pieces of evidence seemed to hang over us, giving no chance for escape. He shouldn't have. I asked Mom, unable to believe what was happening. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mom closed her eyes, and her answer was barely audible, as if she were speaking not to me, but to herself. I begged her not to do it. Her voice became soft, but it was pulling her into a void, and I felt her slipping away from me, as if one more step and she would disappear. Then Nathan's voice broke through, and I didn't even notice how he had come up behind me. His words were broken, and he looked torn, like fabric that couldn't be stitched together. Mom threatened to expose everything. His words carried anxiety and fear that I couldn't ignore. Nathan stood there, his tie crumpled, his face etched with sleepless nights, staring at both of us, but as if he saw nothing. In his eyes, there was no fire that had once burned, no confidence, no resolve. He was a part of this world, but now everything around him felt as alien to him as it did to me. "What do we do now?" Nathan asked, his voice insistent but tinged with anxiety. I raised my father's torn letter, almost crushing it in my hands. This was a warning. The last warning that he had tried to pass on his inheritance to me. I felt the weight of those words. They weren't just about money. It was something more. It was his final gesture, his last attempt to reveal the truth, to give me the weapon to fight what had been hidden in the shadow of his life. It was too much. I stood frozen in place, meeting Nathan's eyes. He looked broken, but he still kept looking at me as if waiting for a decision. And I knew it had to be made. "We'll finish what my father started," I said, feeling confidence start to return, like a small spark that I needed to fan into a flame. "We'll destroy her completely and publicly." Nathan was ready, his eyes burning with resolve, but I noticed something else there, something I couldn't ignore. "It will destroy the company," he said with a heavy sigh. "Maybe it needs to be destroyed." I paused. The whole situation felt impossible, like a snowball growing, gathering everything in its path. But sometimes, to rebuild something, the old has to be torn down. Sometimes, to free yourself from the weight of lies, destruction has to happen. Some things have to break before they can be rebuilt, I said softly, pressing the letter to my chest as if it were part of me. Mom, standing beside me, reached out and took my hand. I felt her warmth, her support, her worry. She was ready to stand with me, even if it meant walking a path full of pain and destruction. She said, whatever I decided, we would face it together. There would be no secrets this time. No secrets. But standing between them, between my mother and my husband, I felt the weight of the decision. I didn't know what I was signing up for. We were all caught in this whirlwind, and each side was pulling me in its direction, but deep down, I knew I had to go where I would be free. And yet, were we ready to understand everything? Were we ready to learn everything? The truth that lay ahead was terrifying. The Parker mansion stood before me, its windows dark, only Helen's office dimly lit, like an eye watching us from above. Its strict lines and high walls seemed as unyielding as her world itself. We stood before this building, which was not just a house, but a symbol of everything we had been trying to destroy. My heart was beating faster, and I once again heard my mother's words from an hour ago. Helen wasn't always like you see her now. Those words echoed in my head, like a warning, like a key that might open some unknown door. Helen wasn't always like this. And now I needed to understand what lay behind her mask. I pulled out my phone, almost not noticing how my hands trembled slightly. The last document was on it. I looked at the screen, and my eyes caught the text, Richard's confession, along with the proof of what had happened to my father, of what had been hidden from me for so many years. It was horrifying. The words he never got to say to me were now part of my fight. I placed the document on her desk, carefully watching every movement. It was signed, and its contents couldn't be hidden. You knew my father was going to expose everything, I said firmly, though inside I was turning over. That's why you made sure he could never do it. Helen froze. A flicker of concern passed through her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by coldness. She leaned forward, as if ready to deflect any blow. You can't prove anything, she spat through clenched teeth, her voice tense, full of rage. The police have Richard's statement, and that's all that's needed. I couldn't believe she thought she had everything under control. With every word, I felt the shadow of her manipulations creeping over me. I recorded it, I said with cold resolve, showing her the screen. The moment Richard's voice filled the space, her face changed. He confessed on the recording how Helen had forged my father's heart medication, slowly killing him. Helen lunged at the phone, trying to do something, but Nathan, who had been standing next to me, quickly grabbed her by the wrist. It's over, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Mom, you ungrateful child. Her gaze became even wilder as she wrenched her arm free from his grip. I gave you everything, and you gave me a cage, she screamed, her words shattering the silence. You don't understand. You don't know what you've done. Nathan said softly, with pain in his voice, that he had called it love. We both knew it was more than just a feeling. It was a fight for survival, for salvation. And in her eyes, we were the enemies. In the distance, sirens howled, and suddenly the air became thick with fear. Helen grabbed something from the edge of the table. I saw the gleam of metal before Nathan could react. She didn't have time. The shot was deafening. Nathan staggered, his face contorted. I couldn't move, but in that moment, everything became clear. He had said we were moving closer, and that the sale of the company would happen tomorrow. Richard stood nearby, his eyes clouded with doubt, but it seemed he was ready to leave it all behind, just like I was. Are you sure you're leaving her? I asked, not taking my eyes off the painting my father had made many years ago. The company died with Mom's confession, and now everything looks different. He just nodded, continuing to study my father's work. There was no bitterness, no regret on his face, only emptiness, like a man who had finally let go of something that had once been a part of his life. I had always considered the painting a symbol, something that kept our family afloat, but now I understood that it was merely a wrapper hiding an unknown shadow. Besides, some legacies aren't worth keeping, Richard said, his voice quiet but confident, as if he were ready to take the final step into a new life. I couldn't disagree with him. Sometimes, it's necessary to let go of the past, and the sooner you do it, the easier it is to breathe. Helen's trial was swift, and despite her desperate attempt to hide the truth, Richard's testimony was a death sentence for her. Admitting guilt was her final step toward freedom, but this freedom came at the cost of her having to fully acknowledge her financial crimes, which had destroyed not only my father's business but many lives. The truth about my father's death now haunted us all. I knew that, whatever her punishment, it would never be enough to atone for all the suffering she had caused. Yet, despite this, I felt a sense of relief that everything had finally fallen into place. I looked at Nathan, who stood silently beside me, gazing off into the distance. His face was tired, but in his eyes, there was the same fire I had once seen when we first met. His words were short and to the point. I got a job offer. He was ready to start over, and I was happy for him. Teaching commercial law at a community college, he continued quietly, as though revealing a new reality to himself. I smiled, remembering his old dreams. I felt a surge of pride for him. He had been honest with himself, and his decision to find a new direction was an important step. It was both a farewell to what had been and the beginning of something new. He touched his wounded shoulder, and I noticed how his face once again bore the features I knew so well. Some wounds remind us who we really are, he said. Or who we could have been. The gallery was filled with guests for the opening night, and I moved among them, playing the role of the hostess, but at some point, I realized that I no longer felt part of the crowd. I was here, but at the same time, I was far away. I walked across the hall, feeling how the world around me slowly became less familiar. Everything that remained of my former life was now behind me. And there, in the back room, I realized that I didn't want to hide my story anymore. Here, among old and new items in my private collection, I felt at home. Paintings, photographs, and objects, each holding its own piece of truth. On the wall hung an old photograph of Helen and Mom laughing, but there was no sincerity or warmth in their eyes. Next to it hung my father's last letter in a frame. I lingered on it, gently touching the glass, as if trying to feel his presence, as if his words had been honest.